Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 20th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Holy cow, 20 episodes. I originally thought there would be 24 total episodes in this entire series, with one each for 24 people I'd picked out for the story arc. Before diving into the story of the Emperor Wu of the Han, I wanted to share a thought that's been on my mind. When I first had the idea for this series, I overlooked something that has come to be important, covering not just the individual, but also the civilization or society from which they hailed. It would be a bit arresting to just start talking about, say, Cyrus the Great without describing who the Persians were, or the history of the Achaemenids, etc. At least with the Persians, however, we had gotten to know some of the successor societies from the same general region, like the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, etc. Last time, when we explored the story of Asoka the Great, the third ruler from India's mighty but short-lived Mauryan Empire, we had to confront something that hadn't faced us in a while. All the way back in our first two episodes, when we got to know Sargon and Thutmose III, we were also meeting their civilizations for the first time. When we met those two, and again when we met Asoka, we couldn't introduce our Great of History without at least a cursory description of the origins of the civilization from which they arose. For Sargon, for example, this wasn't that big of a deal, as his story wasn't too far down the road from the origins of the Akkadians themselves. We didn't have as much ground to cover, so to speak. But by the time we got to Asoka, there were millennia of Indian history. The entire first episode of our coverage of Asoka didn't even really get to Asoka. To get a sense of who he was, we need to establish where he came from, and given the chronology of Indian history, that took a good bit of time. And to be sure, even given the origins and development of Indian civilization, an entire episode was a very cursory coverage of an important region and several complex civilizations and kingdoms. I am trying to balance the right amount of background with getting to our episode's subject in a reasonable amount of time. I also want to be respectful of different cultures and peoples. I'm not Indian, or for that matter Persian or Egyptian, so I'm aiming to hit the right notes in giving an overview of these important people while being mindful of the nuance and details that make those people who they are. All the way back in the introduction, I suggested that a subtitle for this series could be An Incomplete History of the World. Well, the last three episodes were definitely an incomplete history of India, but hopefully there was enough context to make a more complete picture of Asoka. In this episode, we have a similar dilemma. For today, we move to China. Our story will be principally that of Emperor Wu of the Han, the seventh ruler of the Han dynasty, whose remarkable rule stretched across 54 eventful years, from 141 to 87 BCE. As with Asoka, Emperor Wu didn't just materialize. His career was a continuation of a long process of civilization and societal development. This process is both interesting and important, so before we hop onto the jump to conclusion mat, we will spend some time considering the origins of Chinese society, and when we're done, like Asoka, I will probably trip all over myself to convey my admiration for the history of the Chinese people and my sincere hope that I have shown them the respect they deserve. And speaking of tripping all over myself, there are a lot of names we will be encountering that I may struggle to nail. I will do my best, so give me a little room to work my way through it. Also, there are different naming conventions for many of these people, and I tend to drift towards the Latinized versions of the name. For example, our great of today is Emperor Wu of the Han. However, he is often referred to in Chinese literature by the native naming convention of Han Wudi. I mean no disrespect by sticking to the Latinized version. I'm just personally on firmer footing. Plus, it's usually to the name Wu that the great is often attached, so it makes a little more sense. Okay, enough of the prologue. Let's get to know the rise of the remarkable Chinese civilization. People have been living in what we now call China for a long time. A long time. Exactly how long is a matter of conjecture, but some estimates are as high as 1.7 million years ago for the arrival of the first hominids, with tool-making people emerging between 700,000 and 300,000 years ago. Homo sapiens were on the scene around 40,000 years ago. By any measure, China is a very ancient place. When we discussed the development of the Greek and Macedonian culture, we talked about the role that the area's geography had on its political systems. The rugged hills and mountains that isolated the emergent city-states from one another led to several divergent political systems, even when they weren't all that far apart from one another geographically. In time, for example, Athens developed democracy, while Sparta developed an oligarchy capped by a warrior elite. In the grand scheme of things, Greece is not that big of a place, and there was a high degree of interaction between the various Greek polis with adjacent countries and cultures. China was likewise insulated due to its geography, its mountains, oceans, and deserts. But unlike the Greeks, where its proximity to other civilizations ensured a measure of intermingling, China is huge, and ancient Chinese culture developed almost entirely devoid of contact with other outside societies. As will be seen soon, this makes the sophistication of the early Chinese societies, in particular its advances in technology, all the more remarkable. China didn't borrow from other societies in the way that other great cultures did, at least earlier in its history. And yet, it was among the most, if not the most, sophisticated civilization of the ancient world. But this didn't just happen overnight. As mentioned a moment ago, modern Homo sapiens arrived in China about 40,000 years ago. Of course, it's one thing for people to have drifted into and inhabited an area. It's another entirely for a distinctive culture to begin to emerge. In ancient China, the transition from inhabited area to the early rudiments of society can be identified dating back to approximately 6500 BCE, with a remarkable Neolithic society in northeast China called the Huli culture. And no, there was no competing Pied Piper culture. Even by this early age, the Huli culture was adept at pottery, jewelry, tool making, animal husbandry, and agriculture. Over the millennia, the Huli would give way to a series of successor cultures. Civilization in China took a big leap forward along the fertile banks of the Yellow River around 7,000 years ago. Two Neolithic societies independently developed along the Great River. First the Yangshao, circa 5000 to 3000 BCE, and then the Longshan, circa 3000 BCE to 1900 BCE. Likewise, societies began to emerge along the Yangtze River and also along the southern coast. In effect, unlike some other places we've discussed, several Chinese societies seem to have independently developed agriculture and subsequently all the trappings that come with it, like religion, social hierarchy, labor specialization, governance structures, etc. This is in stark contrast to some civilizations where those innovations occurred in one central place then radiated outward. In time, and as our story progresses, these various cultures would undergo a measure of integration, but it's useful to keep in mind that China was extremely complex and far from a united monolithic culture from its very earliest stages. Along the banks and valleys of these great rivers, villages grew and Chinese civilization spread and developed. The river deltas were extremely productive, giving rise to agricultural surpluses, and population density increased in many areas. Like many societies, the earliest distinct individuals in Chinese history are mythical. The origin and stories of Chinese civilization are much like the rivers that nurtured it, winding, twisting, and occasionally overlapping. While we are not here to dive too deep into the founding mythology of ancient China, it's important to highlight a few of these origin stories. This is not a complete overview, and it's worth stressing that there are countless derivatives and interpretations of these stories, so I do not want to give the impression that there is a single orthodoxy. But it's important to at least summarize some of these tales, or at least versions of these tales, because when we get to our subject for this episode, much of his rule will be calibrated around these origin stories, and certain aspects of them will come into renewed focus later in our story. Many of these foundational myths of Chinese civilizations center on a succession of divine ancestor god kings and wise rulers known as the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. There are, of course, many versions of these myths, and the identities of who was a sovereign and who was an emperor varies in different accounts. In some, the first sovereign in Chinese history was Fu Xi, who, along with his sister wife, Nuwa, were the only people to survive a great flood. Together, they re-established the human race. In one eventful week, Nuwa created all the creatures of earth, and on the 7th day, she created man by using the rich alluvial soil of the Yellow River. Not one to sit back and let Nuwa do all the work, Fu Xi invented writing, fishing, and hunting with metal weapons. He also established the patriarchal nature of society and ruled for 116 years. The second sovereign was Shennong, who taught people how to use grains for food and also invented herbal medicines, poisons, and tea. Shennong is still called the Medicine King and celebrated as the founder of Chinese medicine. In many versions of the myth, other important innovations are attributed to Shennong, including the plow, the axe, even trade, commerce, and currency. He really did it all. And it's not for nothing that he is worshipped as a hero and a demigod to this day. The final of the 3 sovereigns was the Yellow Emperor, or Huangdi, Among his contributions were the establishment of centralized government, development of political science, and the establishment of the arts. Huangdi is also given credit for winning great battles and defending China against barbarian invaders, riding the bow and arrow, boats and carts. In echoes of the power duo of Hushi and Nuwa, Huangdi's wife is credited for the invention of silk production. The Yellow Emperor is important to the story because he will become a rallying cry to Wu's dynasty still about 3 millennia in the future. By establishing the bedrocks of Chinese civilization, the 3 sovereigns set the stage for the learned 5 emperors, who were considered as historical ancestors, real people who led with wisdom and sagacity. They were praised, mythologized, and worshipped as the organizers of Chinese civilization. The 5 emperors were considered to be of exemplary moral character, and in addition to ruling with justice and fairness, they served as the intermediaries between mankind and the divine. Taken together, the stories of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors created the foundational worldview that Chinese had of their own origins and provided examples of good and just leadership to which subsequent rulers, including Wu, would turn for guidance. This succession of mythic ancestor rulers serves as the fulcrum on which China slowly transitioned from the fog of prehistory onto increasingly firmer historical footing. As an aside, there's another reason I did a cursory flyover of some of the foundational myths of Chinese civilization, to highlight something we've likely lost to the sands of time. In part 1 of our episode about Ahsoka, we discussed the mysterious rise, collapse, and fall into obscurity, and then rediscovery of the remarkable Indus Valley civilization. The fact that so many myths from the origins of their Chinese counterparts survive only heightens the sense of what knowledge and ideas were lost when the Indus Valley civilization slipped out of the collective consciousness. I'm sure they had every bit as much of a rich and interesting origin and mythology, used to define their world and to their place in it. We should be grateful when such stories survive, even as they morph and shift over millennia. With that in mind, then, let's go back to China and meet another important figure from the mysterious prehistory of the great civilization, Yu the Great. Yes, the Great. Unlike the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, Yu the Great is less of a demigod and more of a semi-mythic and allegorical figure. Allegedly rising to promise in the 2000s BCE, Yu lived in a troubled time, when the Yangtze River and the Yellow River, and all the rivers in between, rose up in a great flood that engulfed all the lands. His predecessor, Gun, had tried and failed to control the waters, and Yu stepped in after Gun either committed suicide or was imprisoned for his failure. This flooding, and isn't it interesting how almost every civilization has a great flood story, destroyed fields and led to great suffering and sorrow. Resolved to rise to the challenge and to protect the people, Yu devised and enacted a sweeping plan, breathtaking in its scope. By his orders, canals and ditches were dug, dikes were constructed. As his plan came together, Yu slowly wrestled control of the waters away from nature, or the gods, and into the hands of man. It took tremendous effort. For 13 years, Yu toiled, fighting back the floods in a desperate struggle to save his people from the catastrophe. So engrossed was he in this task that he didn't even return home, staying out and traveling here and there until the monumental engineering project was complete. Yu became known as the controller of waters. It was for this monumental accomplishment that Yu was and is reverentially referred to as Yu the Great, as well as Yu the Engineer. Having thus cemented his legitimacy, Yu established the first dynasty in China, the Xia dynasty. Because of his vision and wisdom, Yu was recognized as the rightful and best ruler over all the people. And while any confirmation of the Xia still seems a way off, there is, however, archaeological evidence of canal systems on the Yangtze River dating back 5,000 years, making this sophisticated engineering roughly contemporaneous with the establishment of the first dynasty in Egypt, the early dynastic period of Sumeria, and the earliest periods of the Indus Valley civilization. The story of Yu and his great feats of strength emphasize how important the control of the rivers was to the legitimacy of any ruler. Whether he was real or not, Yu is an important figure in Chinese history, for not only is the control of the waters attributed to him, so too are the origin of the Chinese system of governance, the centralized state control and dynastic succession that would define China for millennia. By pointing to Yu as the founder of the Xia dynasty, Chinese history thus has a beginning point for the dynastic system that would continue for the next 4,000 years. And just like the Yellow Emperor, Yu the Great will re-enter the story in a few thousand years when our main focus for the episode takes the stage. Now, the dynastic history of China is too long and complicated to go through dynasty by dynasty, so we're going to have to skip around a little bit. This is not necessarily a history of China, but goodness, it's an endlessly fascinating and complicated topic. As with other points in this series, I will certainly encourage you to explore it further if it catches your imagination. So some of what comes next is highly selective and as a result an incomplete chronology. Following the Xia was the Shang dynasty. It is in this transition that we move from mythology to confirmed historicity. Ruling from their base in the Yellow River Valley, this dynasty is important because it is the oldest for which there is firm archaeological evidence. One of the most noteworthy innovations to arise from this time period was the development of the early Chinese writing system. Every society seeks to divine the future, and the Chinese were no different. Seers would carve symbols into animal bones, then expose the bones to fire. The resulting cracks in the bones would then be interpreted, and in time, the patterns in these bones became the basis for the Chinese writing system. Such oracle bones, as they are called, are a treasure trove of information about the development of Chinese society, including philosophy, religion, medicine, and of course, the language itself. Inscribed oracle bones have been found across the broad range of the Shang Empire, with tens of thousands being excavated to date. The Shang period also witnessed the transition from rural, agrarian life to true urbanization. The agricultural productivity of the Yellow River Valley allowed for significant food surpluses. This catalyzed trade and commerce, which in turn gave rise to cities. As we've seen over and over in this series, surpluses and cities result in specialization of labor, art, cultural developments, religious hierarchy, and so much more. In addition to giving China its written language and urban development, the Shang also deployed the resulting specialized labor to advance metallurgy to unprecedented heights. They produced stunning pieces of cast bronze that almost defy belief. The artistry and sophistication of these objects are extraordinary enough, but when we consider the amount of social organization necessary to produce such works, from mining the various ores, to transportation, to refinement, smelting, organizing all the labor, producing sufficient heat, development of the furnace technology, etc., the resultant works are utterly and completely astonishing. Likewise, Shang weavers made dramatic advances in the development of silk fabrics, establishing what was soon to be one of the most lucrative trade Chinese goods, a precursor to the famous Silk Road that a certain guy featured in this podcast will institute a bit further down the road. Chinese silk was one of the first truly global trade commodities, making its way into the world and far, far away. Chinese silk was an extremely valued and kingly luxury product. For example, it's been found in Egyptian royal tombs from the period, a distance of nearly 8,000 miles. These stunning textile and artistic pieces produced by the Shang are more than art. They are symbols of a supremely sophisticated culture and its people. The Shang ruled for about half a millennium, from around 1600 BCE until 1064 BCE. Now, if you notice that we just went from a vague, suspiciously round number at the start of their rule to a very precise one at the end, then check out the big brain on you. One of the joys of chronological history is moving closer to certainty over dates and events, and in 1064 BCE, one such event dramatically shifted the balance of power in the Yellow River Basin. After 500 plus years, the Shang got pretty insufferable, and many people agitated for change. One of the subordinate clans chafed under Shang rule and rose up in revolt. This group, the semi-nomadic Zhou, was led in this revolutionary product by their leader, King Wen. An ascendant power, the Zhou met with early successes in their quest to topple their overlords and assume power for themselves. But they had a bit of a problem. To address it, and before they could complete their overthrow of the ruling structure, the Zhou ushered in an important innovation in Chinese society. Any seizure of power accomplished by rebellion is always going to have a legitimacy problem, and the Zhou sought a justification for their attempt to overthrow their rulers. King Wen of the Zhou developed the initial idea that would come to be known as the Mandate of Heaven, which claimed that a worthy and noble leader was selected by the divine force to rule. But should that person fail to live up to their obligations as a ruler, then the divine force would withdraw its favor and the people would suffer. In such troubled times, rebellion would be justified in overthrowing a king or emperor, as clearly that ruler was no longer sanctioned by the divine, by the mandate of heaven. Success in rebellion was a sign that the divine force had transferred its favor and thus officially sanctioned the new ruler as the one chosen to lead. Wen died before the successful completion of the revolution, and it was up to his son to finish the great project. That son, the delightfully named Wu of the Zhou, and no, it's not that Wu, led the Zhou forces into battle in 1064 BCE, crushing the Shang and firmly establishing the new Zhou dynasty. The deposed emperor of the Shang fled the battlefield, locked himself into his palace, set it ablaze, and immolated himself inside of his palace. It was a dramatic end to the first historically confirmed dynasty in Chinese history. The Mandate of Heaven had delivered the kingdom for Zhou, but it was a double-edged sword for the kings of the Zhou period. It's never bad to say to your people that you're king because the gods want you to be king. So in a very real way, the deployment of the divine was a great way to cement legitimacy. At the same time, however, the concept opened the door to other upstarts who could just as easily claim that the godhead had withdrawn its support and used the Mandate of Heaven as a justification to rise up and revolt. And as we will see shortly, in the Zhou period, that happened a lot. King Wu had lots of younger brothers. Firmly in control, he set them up as rulers of various territories and cemented ties with other elite families through marriage alliances. When King Wu died, his intended successor was his young son, but this son was not yet of age, and Wu's brother, the young princeling's uncle, the Duke of Zhou, took over as ruler during a regency period. Immediately, and as has happened over and over the course of this series, rebellions broke out across the empire, including several from Wu's younger brothers who wanted the throne for themselves. The Duke of Zhou methodically subdued these rebellions, bringing the area back under control, consolidating the imperial administration, and definitively establishing the central authority of the Zhou. The Duke of Zhou is a seminal figure in Chinese history. Lauded as a warrior poet, he simultaneously expanded and consolidated Zhou power and further developed the political philosophy that dictated the norms of kingship, the obligation of rulers to their people, and moral and ethical frameworks of governance. The Duke of Zhou was seen as wise, integral, and incorruptible, a worthy successor of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. It was the Duke of Zhou that fully developed and articulated the concept of the Mandate of Heaven. And when his nephew came of age, the Duke dutifully turned over power, forgoing his own ambitions out of a sense of duty and obligation. The legend of the Duke took root and began to spread. In a few hundred years, this legend would be the inspiration for the ideas and policies put forth by another great philosopher now known the world over as one of the most famous people in human history, Confucius. For about 100 years, in what's now called the Western Zhou period, the dynasty thrived. But in another theme we've seen over and over, successive generations tend to lack the energy and vigor of the preceding ones, and the dynasty slowly began to decline, with power devolving from a central authority to the rulers of the nominally subordinate vassal states. This gave rise to a social structure similar to the feudalism that would spread across Western Europe following the collapse of the Roman Empire. In 771 BCE, about 300 years after the establishment of the Zhou dynasty, the Zhou moved their capital to the east, which initiated what is now known as the Eastern Zhou period. Nominally, the dynasty continued for another 500 years, but the Zhou's grip on power was tenuous at best. Power devolved to a dozen smaller states, rendering the politics of the time extremely complicated. The first half of this chaotic period is now known as the Spring and Autumn period. Despite the turmoil, or maybe because of it, several big leaps forward occurred in spiritual and political thinking. This flowering of thought and ideas stood in stark contrast to the geopolitical situation, which deteriorated with each passing decade. In time, the intellectual productivity of this time period would come to be known as the 100 schools of thought, a tip of the cap to the incredible diversity of ideas, wisdom, beliefs, etc. that emerged out of the chaos of the later Zhou period. Politically, this period was a mess. Intellectually, China was enjoying something of a golden age. I cannot think of another time that we've covered in this series when warring factions didn't drag their people into a dark age. It's remarkable, really. The history of China at this time stands toe-to-toe with any of the great intellectual times in human history, including the Greek age of philosophy and the European Renaissance. This was a deeply intense and sophisticated intellectual age. Covering 100 different schools of thought is way too much for this episode, but 3 or 4 of the traditions that emerge warrant specific attention. The first of these was the development of Taoism. Both a philosophy and a religion, Taoism advocates that humanity should live in balance with the way of the universe, the Tao. Taoism teaches that the universe has an energy, qi, which is present in and guides everything. This energy is not God or gods. Rather, gods are an extension of qi. Humanity should live in harmony with this energy by achieving balance with the 2 countervailing forces of energy, the yin and yang. These forces balance one another out, such as light and dark, hot and cold, effort and stillness. By finding balance with these forces, humanity moves closer to being in harmony with the qi of the universe. According to tradition, Taoism was first brought forth by the philosopher Lao Tzu when he wrote the seminal text of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching. According to the legends, Lao Tzu was a bureaucrat in the Zhou court. Today, most historians believe he is a mythical figure and that the Tao Te Ching is an accumulation of the works and teachings of several people. Regardless of whether he lived or not, Taoism emerged during the spring and autumn period as one of the 100 schools of thought and was hugely influential in shifting how people thought about the universe and their role in it. In particular, Taoism shaped the thinking of another prominent philosopher whose work would, in time, come to be the foundational doctrine guiding a unified Chinese empire, Confucius. Confucius was born in or around 551 BCE in the Lu state. You will remember that at this time, the Zhou kingdom was highly decentralized and had a dozen smaller states ruling in their own right and name. The Lu was one of these petty states. Confucius's burning ambition was to be an important member of the imperial court. Despite his talent and unique insights into the nature of mankind and the exercise of power, he struggled to make much of a career for himself, failing to gain a key post. He tried to share his ideas and influence policy, but the Lu state was troubled and chaotic, and his wisdom fell on deaf ears. He was kind of a less cynical Machiavelli, or maybe because Confucius definitely came first, Machiavelli was a more cynical Confucius. Frustrated at his inability to gain influence at court, Confucius went into self-imposed exile. He left Lu, and he took his show on the road. For 15 years, he traveled to most of these states, offering his services to the various rulers of the various kingdoms. People seemed well disposed to hear what he had to say, and his teachings seemed to have been considered as useful, but he failed to secure himself a senior post in any of these kingdoms. Imagine having Confucius, knock on your door and put himself at your service and saying, "Nah, I'm good." And yet, that just kept happening over and over. After a decade and a half of wandering, in and around 483 BCE, Confucius returned home. He had accumulated a lot of ideas and experiences over the course of his wanderings. He gathered several dozen students around him and spent his days teaching. We can be grateful to these students because many of them started writing things down. Despite his disappointment over the trajectory of his career, Confucius was fundamentally an optimist. Central to his teaching was the belief that humans were essentially good. He idealized the learned and benevolent ruler, guided by a sense of duty and obligation, holding up the Duke of Zhou as an example of outstanding achievement in the field of excellence. In many ways, Confucius did not present new and novel concepts. Rather, he appealed to a sense of tradition and emphasized filial piety. He urged people to hold themselves to the highest possible ethical standards above and beyond what was required of them by law. Personal ethics are not only an obligation of the individual, but also something that must be cultivated through careful self-reflection. Each person should achieve growth through learning. Expanding knowledge leads to better thoughts. Better thoughts become better actions. For Confucius, ethics and morality started at the inner core of the individual and radiated out into the world. These beliefs had profound implications for his framework for proper government. To be just and moral, leaders could not rely on force or coercion to assert their will on their subjects. Rather, rulers needed to prove they earned the mandate of heaven through justice and benevolence. Each person in the Confucian system must care for the community around them. A ruler must care for all the communities in their domains. Punishments for criminals were a failure of the leader or ruler. 4. Should a leader practice genuine piety and morality in the discharge of their duty, then no one would need to commit a crime. Leaders, therefore, had to lead by example. They must demonstrate piety, gentleness, morality, frugality, and unsurpassed ethical integrity. Their people must follow this example, and the whole kingdom would then be in harmony. There was more at stake in Confucianism than simply the morality and ethics of the individual. In his system, Confucius taught the idea that moral harmony of the individual manifests itself in environmental harmony. If people were peaceful, gentle, and just, then the natural rhythms of the environment would be too. But if people were troubled, unethical, immoral, then the consequences would manifest through disasters like fires and floods. The physical and moral worlds were intertwined. Confucius bequeathed to us possibly the most famous aphorism of all time. His golden rule rings loud and true to this day. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The next time you hear that aphorism, thank Confucius. For that matter, thank his students, who learned by his side and wrote down his wisdom. One in particular, Mencius, every bit the intellectual equal of his mentor, carried forth the intellectual tradition founded by Confucius when the great master died at age 71 or 72 in 479 BCE. While we don't have time to get too deep into it now, Mencius made significant contributions to the advancement and development of Confucian thought, and it's quite possibly that he is actually the author of many of the words and sayings attributed to his great mentor. Mencius is likewise a titan of Chinese, and for that matter, human intellectual history. This is, of course, a cursory look at a complex philosophy, and hopefully it provides a foundation for some of the ideas to follow. Once again, there's a lot to Confucianism, so please look further if this catches your imagination. The Confucian ideals of innate goodness of the individual and the obligation of rulers to act with gentleness and to refrain from punishment put significant burden on rulers. Not surprisingly, they had their counterpart in the nearly reverse image doctrine that also emerged at this time. This system, called legalism, was yet another of the philosophical frameworks that was developed during the 100 Schools of Thought period. Legalism rebuked the idea that people were fundamentally good, opting for the cynical view that people were flawed and prone to evil. A strong state could only be accomplished by a strong leader who understands the weakness and corruptibility of his subjects. This leader must be ready to dispense justice, often through harsh punishment and brutal repression of dissent. The contrast between Confucianism and legalism was more than theoretical. As we inch closer to Wu the Great, these two systems will come into stark opposition. This period of thinking was so rich, so multifaceted, that we're really just scratching the surface. I know we need to get on with the story, but I have to mention one more school of thought. In this same general time period, another piece of philosophical thinking also came forth to shake up how people thought about strategy and warfare. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. This seminal text is at both times tactically useful and strategically brilliant. Offering advice on everything from logistics to diplomacy, The Art of War has transcended the military genre and entered the intellectual consciousness as full of wisdom and strategies that can be applied to all walks of life. Expect the best, plan for the worst is useful in almost any situation, as is the idea that before a battle is even fought, you must first win in your own mind. The Art of War is loaded with wisdom that not only made it a useful field guide for ancient Chinese military leaders, but also for all sorts of people to this day. Taoism, Confucianism, legalism, the Art of War, four paradigmatic ways of thinking, all emerging in the same time period from the same region, and these were just some of the ideas that were freely flowing in the 100 Schools of Thought period. This was a deeply important time for the history of human thought. It's not overstating things to say that the Chinese thinkers of the late Zhou period did as much to develop humanity's view of itself as any group at any time, anywhere, ever. Much respect. For the people living in the late Zhou period, they needed all the help they could get. Any sense of equilibrium that had been achieved with the foundation of dozens of smaller kingdoms, each governing their own domains, became severely disrupted beginning around 475 BCE. In what is evocatively named the Warring States period, the minor kingdoms began to fight with each other, often in a murky and confused timeline of warfare, alliances, betrayals, victories, losses, and just general chaos. Nominally, the Zhou king was still sovereign, but this explosion of violence rendered the Zhou as oblivious and toothless figureheads. Through outward expansion by some at the expense of others, the dozen or so lesser kingdoms of the spring and autumn period gave way to 7 larger, more powerful, and more ambitious kingdoms. During the Warring States period, these 7 kingdoms began vying for supremacy, with each vowing to emerge as the hegemon over all the others. The history of this time period is extremely complicated, with different states and factions rising and falling, gaining and losing the upper hand, and generally going after one another with bloodthirsty abandon. It was a time of chaos, and it lasted 2.5 centuries, the current length of U.S. history, all one giant civil war. Paradoxically, the warfare didn't cause these societies to regress. Rather, with so much on the line, the fighting catalyzed reforms and technological advances each would need to strengthen their position relative to the others. One such kingdom, the Xin, entered the Warring States period as the weakest of the 7 states slugging it out. Xin had long been seen by other states as a backwater. The Xin were slow to adopt the hallmarks of Chinese culture. For example, they continued to perform human sacrifice long after all other groups had abandoned the practice. The Zhou rulers had been dismissive of the Xin. At first, this haughtiness seemed justified. In earlier phases of the fighting, the Xin got the worst of things. Socially and militarily lagging their rivals, the Qin needed to advance themselves if they wanted to stand a chance in the roiling conflict of the Warring States period. Knowing that they needed help to do so, the ruler of the Qin took the bold step of inviting foreigners of talent to join his court and lend him advice. In exchange, they would be treated with great honor and given landed estates. Several joined in the project, including the noted administrator Shang Yang, and the Qin set about overhauling their country from top to bottom. Eschewing the gentle humanity of Confucianism, the Qin adopted the more draconian and more efficient legalism. They overhauled the administration, the military, agriculture, everything. They shifted Qin governance away from a military ruled by hereditary nobles and instead focused on placing in command men of talent and merit. The Qin also organized public works projects to be conducted by conscripted public labor. They built infrastructure, agricultural systems, irrigation, and drainage. This led to a substantial surge in agricultural productivity, which in turn allowed the Qin to feed and thus field a huge army. As a reward for all of his invaluable contributions to the Qin administrative, Shang Yang was charged with treason by arrogant nobles. He tried to defend himself, but he was seized and suffered a brutal, humiliating public execution, being pulled apart by 5 chariots. Shang Yang might have been killed, but the ideas about governance and reform he had brought with him had taken hold. Around the end of the 4th century BCE and the start of the 3rd, the Qin began a period of rapid expansion from their territory in the Yangtze River basin. Moving east, north, and south, the Qin eventually crushed and subdued all the other rival states. By 221 BCE, they had conquered all and consolidated power into a single kingdom, which initiated the Qin dynasty. The accomplishment of the Qin was greater than simply besting all rivals in the Warring States period. Their triumph led to the first unification of China in its history. So singular was their accomplishment, so sweeping was the territory that they controlled, that the name China is derived from the Qin. Every time someone says China, they're acknowledging the role that the Qin played in consolidating the vast country into a single geopolitical entity. Now, this seems like a good place to pause the story. If you're paying attention to the chronology, you will know that we stopped this narrative nearly a century before the rise of Wu the Great. True, like the Ahsoka episode, in trying to provide some foundational context, we needed to go back to the beginning of an ancient and fascinating culture. When you think about it, we covered a lot of ground, and my sincere anxiety is not that I spent too much time on ancient China, but that I did not spend enough. It is an amazing, fascinating, and enigmatic origin story, going from the early days of myth and legend to the consolidation of China into an integrated political structure for the first time is a meaningful journey. But, clever me, I did, of course, make sure we got One the Great in this episode. So if anyone is really insistent that we cover or talk about One the Great in every single episode, then you can give the accolades to Yu the Great, the man who controlled the floodwaters and initiated dynastic rule in China. But worry not, Wu is lurking on the horizon. We will get to him next time, and we will do it fairly quickly. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us for the next one when we dive into the chaotic time following the death of China's first emperor, discover the swift collapse of the dynasty he spilled so much blood to establish, and spend time getting to know one of the most fascinating and consequential figures in China's long, long history, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, or as many call him, Wu the Great.